Welcome to the France 24 debate. A vote in the US Senate has made the international newsrooms sit up and take notice. Ours in particular, of course, the Senate voting to end US support for the conflict in Yemen. This is just a first step. The Republican-dominated Senate, though, going against President Trump. Trump has made clear his support for the Saudi-led coalition. Trump loudly defending arms deals, and now his characteristic America First rhetoric is becoming well-known world over. But it seems even his own side's become somewhat embarrassed by his stance and his response to the murder of the dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So what does this mean for the US president, for the war in Yemen, and for the future relationship between the Saudis and the West? Lots to discuss here. Our guests to chew all these issues over. William Jordan, former State Department official. William, thank you, sir, for joining us. Pierre Canessa is a former French Defense Ministry official, author of The Saudi Terror Machine, The Truth About Radical Islam and Saudi Arabia Revealed. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us. Pleasure to see you again. And a familiar face, Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator. Doug, great to see you. Let's kick off this debate, though, with a report about the situation so far. Alison Sargent with this.
The motion is agreed to.
With a nearly two-thirds majority, the U.S. Senate votes to advance a resolution ending the country's support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, a bipartisan rebuke for both Riyadh and the White House.
U.S. intervention in Yemen is unauthorized, unconstitutional, and immoral.
The issue of war making, of going to war, putting our young men and women's lives at stake, is something determined by the U.S. Congress, not the President of the United States.
U.S. support for the Saudi coalition in Yemen includes intelligence sharing and training Saudi pilots. Top Trump administration officials had fought to persuade lawmakers that a regional counterbalance to old adversary Iran was more important than Riyadh's alleged murder of a Saudi journalist in Istanbul last month, or the millions of Yemenis currently on the brink of starvation after 4 years of war. Talks between the Saudi-backed government and the rebel Houthis are set for early December in Sweden.
I think we are close to create the conditions for the possibility for peace talks to start, and that would be an extremely important objective.
Just ahead of the U.S. Senate vote, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman arrived for the G20 summit in Buenos Aires, where Argentinian prosecutors are considering a request from Human Rights Watch to press charges against the Crown Prince for alleged war crimes.
Yeah. So this is a situation which in many ways is very much unprecedented. The Senate going against advice, urging them not to go against Donald Trump, and voting as a first step to withdraw support for the war in Yemen. William Jordan, I'll bring you in first on this one. Were you surprised at this? Do you see this developing and going the full way?
I'm not entirely surprised. I mean, this motion has been out there since, I believe, February in its current form, in this resolution. And it's important to bear in mind the political context in Washington in which all of this is supposed to be done is very fraught right now, because we're in the lame duck session of the current Congress, which will give way, of course, to the new Congress in January, when the Democrats come in to take over majority seats in the House. So there's a lot of business, including extending the budget deal that was passed earlier in the lame duck session to try to fund the government and avoid a shutdown. And that right now is actually the big story in Washington, even though this is getting a lot of headlines now because, as you said, there are a lot of people on the Republican side who have been willing to sign on to, and it's very important to stress this, the move to bring this resolution to the full Senate floor for a vote next week, which would then send it over to the House. It's a joint resolution where its fate is uncertain because the Republicans in the House are expected not either to vote it in its current form or to amend it in some way. So, yes, it's an important step, but it crystallizes a lot of unhappiness and opposition to what the Saudis and the Saudi-led coalition have been doing in Yemen for years. Some of these elements that are in this joint resolution go back to the Obama administration when this first came out. So, yes, it's important, but I wouldn't at this point say that because this vote passed by such a large margin now, it's necessarily going to pass from the Congress and arrive on President Trump's desk, where, of course, he can veto it. The other thing to bear in mind is that even if it all goes according to that plan, Trump vetoes it, there's no way that in the House and the Senate, 2/3 of the members in each chamber will come up with the votes to override the veto.
So that's the situation. Nonetheless, Pierre, this is quite a development in many ways.
Well, you know, I don't understand the debate because, you know, the American aid to coalition, Arab coalition, is mainly military, which means that it's mainly intelligence and target sharing. There are also air fueling, which has been stopped. You know, that's the only decision made by Trump since the Khashoggi affair. I'm asking me a question. I mean, if American provide, you know, target sharing, when you think about the events of the 9th of August, in which, you know, the Saudi Air Force has bombed, you know, a school bus in which they killed 40 people. I mean, what's the use of target sharing? I mean, is there American responsibility in that murder, you know? I mean, the question should be that one. It's not just a general question. I mean, what's the effect of the military assistance of America?
Because there have been lots of, well, obviously accusations made by the UN, for instance, that the side of that coalition has been attacking civilian targets.
Yes. I mean, well, I know that the Saudi pilots are not good. That's, I mean, it's not only the responsibility of American intelligence, I know. But, I mean, they don't care. I mean, they bomb anywhere. So the responsibility of American government is very entire.
Douglas.
Well, and the word that has been used again and again is indiscriminate targeting. Indiscriminate, exactly what you were just talking about, targeting of civilian targets, but also civilian infrastructure as well. So it does raise the point, you know, not only from Congress's point of view, the reason that this is such a striking rebuke in many ways is you essentially have the Congress calling time on this whole thing, saying, wait a second. From a lot of the senators' point of view, and it is extraordinary, I think we have to underline the fact, having 14 Republicans cross the aisle to vote with all of the Democrats to start this motion, put it in progress. It's extraordinary. It's a rare display of, it's obviously not all the Republicans, but bipartisan unity to a certain extent. They are fed up, and they are basically calling time on what they see as an illegal war, as a war which was never authorized and never declared by Congress, and a war which, after nearly 4 years, we keep saying 3, but it's almost going to be 4 soon, after almost 4 years of how many, I don't even know what the statistics are anymore. Yemen's pre-war population was almost 30 million. Some estimates range up to 14 million, brink of starvation, means could die, right? Tens of thousands have died. So they're calling
dead. That was an old estimate, you know.
They're exactly. So on the two levels, even Khashoggi aside, and all of the outrage and horror over that, and the outcry that's provoked, just looking at this war in and of itself, the worst humanitarian catastrophe of modern times right now, that is what really has gotten Congress, if not to march in lockstep, at least to have this display of a lot of outrage against the Trump administration, what they see as Trump and his administration associates to sort of cover up, to basically mislead, deceive them with disingenuous reasoning and argumentation.
You know, Trump and the U.S.
What about the cholera disease
and the disease as well, not to mention all of the disease.
All these things wrapping up to a real humanitarian disaster. Gentlemen, let me pause you for a second and bring in by satellite from Washington, Fatima Al Asiri, who's senior analyst at the Arabia Foundation. Fatima, thank you very much for joining us. Excuse me, just clearing my throat there. I'd like your reaction to this this vote that's happened in the Senate. Sort of, you know, were you surprised by what happened? Where do you feel this can go?
It was. I think, you know, this has been, there's been a lot of talk about this for a while. There was the initial vote in March that just did not go through. I mean, it was kind of expected that this is going to happen because Congress was really eager to take a position, seeing that the administration hasn't taken a position on Saudi Arabia. So in a sense, Congress, what was really surprising was to see 14 Republicans vote for this in a way that they were saying, you know, we're not really agreeing with the Trump administration here on their unconditional support for Saudi Arabia. We want to say that, you know, if the administration does not reconsider its approach, then we can put the pedal on this and stop this relationship from, you know, just going forward with impunity. So I think this has been, it's not necessarily a surprise, but you could have seen it really coming, and especially after the upheaval here in Washington, D.C. over the Khashoggi murder. But what is interesting here is that, as much as, you know, as a Yemeni analyst, as a person from Yemen myself, much of this is being packaged as, you know, something that could influence the trajectory in Yemen. I don't think it would, because the Saudis ultimately will continue using their weapons, whatever weapons they have, in order to continue going on with this war. What is going on at the moment is that Congress is just saying, we don't want a part in this war. And as mentioned before, the president still has an opportunity to veto this. And of course, there's going to be debate, which I think even senators are not really quite sure how this debate is going to materialize, what is going to come out of this debate, is it going to even be relevant to the war powers at all. So, so much of this is really the Congress just wanting to say that, you know, we want to tell the administration that it needs to reevaluate its relationship with Saudi Arabia. But as a Yemeni, I just don't think that this has anything to do with Yemen, really.
We'll be back to you in a moment, Fatima, for more comment. Thank you very much indeed. We've had our first tweet come in on this matter. It's asking the question, why did it take a dead journalist to take action? Why did it take a dead journalist to take action against the slaughter of innocent people in Yemen? William.
Well, again, I think it comes down to the politics. If you're talking about congressional action and a response to or challenge, if you will, to the Trump administration's policy, it took Khashoggi's murder to basically crystallize a lot of strong unhappiness about the U.S.-Saudi relationship in Washington to bring this vote, which, again, you know, this resolution has been voted on before, the same discharge motion, to bring it straight to the Senate floor as opposed to going through the committee, where things like this can often die in hearings, failed previously. And it was only because these 14 Republicans decided to, this time, and some of them probably with no intention of voting on the final resolution when it's put to a vote, they did ultimately agree, following Khashoggi's murder, that yes, we need to have a real debate on the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, and whether what we're basically complicit in Yemen is acceptable as policy, as American policy. Is it consistent with our values? Is it consistent with even our aims in the region? And so I think that, you know, the problem with a lot of this is that, and as was just said by Fatima Al Asiri in Washington, this is not going to change the trajectory of the conflict in Yemen for the time being. I mean, what Washington does, even if tomorrow it were to go even a step further and say, okay, we're going to cut off arms deliveries to Saudi Arabia, it's not going to stop the Saudis and the other members of the coalition from proceeding in this war.
And of course, those arms may come from somewhere else. We'll get into this in part 2 of our debate. Thank you very much indeed. Stay with us, more to come after a very short break. Sorry. Welcome back to the France 24 debate. Part 2, we're debating the US Senate's decision to vote to end support for the war in Yemen. It is a first step, but nonetheless a very significant step, which is very much a slap in the face in many ways to Donald Trump, who of course has a very close relationship, publicly stated, with Saudi Arabia. But here we have senators crossing the floor to vote against what the president would actually have been asking for, to give his backing to what is going on in Yemen, and of course the Saudi position. Donald Trump, of course, has his own point of view, which has been well stated. America first. It's about keeping the arms deals, keeping the jobs going. But many people across the world, humanitarians in particular, disgusted at what's happening in Yemen and the fact that so many lives are being lost and half the population is at risk of famine. Let's bring in our guests with no further delay to discuss this situation. Here in the studio, William Jordan, former State Department official. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Pierre Canessa is a former French Defense Ministry official and author of The Saudi Terror Machine, The Truth About Radical Islam and Saudi Arabia Revealed. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator, is with us too, and joining us by satellite from Washington, Fatima Al Asiri, who is senior analyst at the Arabia Foundation. Fatima, I heard you say you are from Yemen. The situation in your home country, I imagine for you, is of an almost constant concern.
Yes. I don't think that there's going to be really a resolution to this war anytime soon without, serious peace talks. The problem is on the ground, the power is really, although there's a lot of territory that is being now under the control of the internationally recognized government, the government is not operating at full capacity. Then you have the other problem, which is the Houthi has control over populated areas like the capital in Sana'a and in Hodeidah, and they're using this as a card in their hand to negotiate. And basically, really, they have nothing to give up as long as they have these important cities. So the Iran-backed Houthi militia are unfortunately in a position of strength and in a position of negotiated strength, although militarily they are perhaps at their weakest after these 4 years of war. So, people are really fed up from the all sort of totalitarian control that is perpetuated by the Houthis in Sana'a. They are trying to bring more awareness and attention to it, but there is another side that we also see in these areas, which is the humanitarian catastrophe, and the other third layer, which is has to do with the aerial bombardments that happened and the complicity of the United States or others in this war. And I think all of these issues are starting to become in competition with each other, that it may not necessarily be, there isn't necessarily a formal strategy from the United States or others countries in terms of how to really deal with stabilization in Yemen. So as much as we hear about, calls for stopping the war in Yemen, we're really not hearing about stabilization and how that can happen. Of course, the Special UN Envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffith, is doing some efforts, but the efforts are really seen as externally led because on the ground, no one is really calling for peace. The Houthi militia is increasing its call for jihad. They are fortifying their control over the cities. They're recruiting child soldiers, and they're again sending ballistic missiles to Saudi Arabia and trying their best to continue this this war and maintain the upper hand. Because at the end of it, when peace is going to happen, they want to share power with whatever government that comes. And a question that's on mind of a lot of Yemenis is, is the West also going to become now complicit in empowering a militia, an Iranian-backed militia, that is up to no good in Yemen? So there are really, signs of concerns in Yemen that the international community is not necessarily strategic when it comes to finding a solution for Yemen. That calls for stopping the war are simply, focused on the behavior of Saudi Arabia and U.S. allies, and not really closely looking into what the Iranians have been doing in Yemen and what the Houthis and have been basically perpetuating in terms of the misery and control and just brutal control over the cities. They have silenced dissent. They have controlled. Talking about journalists who are being murdered in our region. You've got, over 2,000 Yemeni journalists, political analysts, or anybody with an opinion is really locked up in jail, and people are being murdered almost on a daily basis. But these events, because they're happening in Yemen, don't really necessarily generate a lot of headlines or awareness.
Fatima, we're trying to change that with this
media.
debate, to try and bring focus onto that, and we've let you speak in order to get that out, and thank you very much for telling us about what's happening there. If you don't mind, I'll pause you there and bring in some of the other guests to get some wider analysis maybe of what could happen next. We've had a tweet coming in talking about Constructive Alliance, talking we need to find a way to recraft the future of Yemen. That from Derek Bedison 3. Keep your tweets coming, of course. We'll put them on the wall and try and get our guests to comment on that one. William, Pierre, Douglas, the idea of Constructive Alliance, of creating something, the stability that Fatima was talking about there. How do you begin to construct that with all the problems that Fatima has just outlined very graphically? Where do you begin, Pierre?
Well, as far as I know, the casual situation of Yemen is crisis. Just remember that the war between Saudi Arabia and Nasser Egypt in the 60s, they both are intervening, for the north and south. And they never stabilize the Yemen, because the Yemen is a very strange country in which the central power is not really power. So if you want to stabilize Yemen, you have to organize something which looks like a federation. Well, that's the first point. The second point is that we would like to give you a military opinion about that war.
Go ahead.
Actually, the military campaign of Saudi Arabia is mainly air campaign, which means they are bombing, no troops on the ground, which means that if you stop, to provide armaments, and I just remember that Lockheed Martin was the provider of the missile which killed 40 children in August. Well, if you stop to provide this kind of armaments, the Saudi would have the choice to send troops, which seems very destabilizing for the Saudi Air Force, or to stop the war. The other question, for us, France, is the role of Emirates, because the armaments used by Emirates are mainly French. So the last question is, what should we do with Al-Qaeda in Arabic Peninsula? Because it's a war with three partners. That's very original. It's the new one, which means that if you stop to provide armaments, in a way you will less down, we slow down the level of violence. And you have to, as an American, as a French, I do think that Al-Qaeda in Arabic Peninsula is a threat more important than the Houthi.
I just want to jump in and say, one of the biggest problems,
Fatima,
one of the biggest problems with the dealing with the conflict in Yemen at the moment is that, faute de mieux, the Saudi-led narrative on what's going on, namely that this is Iranian-backed Houthi versus the legally constituted, internationally recognized government, and that what Saudi Arabia is doing is not only and the rest of the coalition is not only protecting their own security, because the Houthis are lobbing missiles every now and then towards Riyadh, towards the Emirates, towards anybody around, and they're threatening international shipping and that kind of thing. There's no question the Houthis pose a problem. But the Saudis have dressed this up as part of the surrogate proxy war with Iran, which, and there's no question about it, the Iranians are now very much using the Houthis as an agent against Saudi Arabia in this sort of, we talked about chess games, this sort of poorly played chess game in the region. There's no question about that. I think that, the problem, though, is that Yemen's difficulties, Yemen's challenges, far exceed simply a matter of coming to some kind of understanding between the Houthis and the legal government. You have problems of secessionism. You still have the south of Yemen, which is, which was once an independent country from the north of Yemen. There are secessionist tendencies and desires by people in the south that have to be addressed. Yes, there is the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the remnants of that group that are out there. There has been the chronic mismanagement of the agriculture and the economy, the richness of Yemen that goes back decades to, especially in the northern part of Yemen, where khat, this this addictive semi-narcotic plant, has largely displaced other cash crops that would allow Yemen to be able to feed its own people. So this has created a whole set of long-standing and deeply rooted issues that need to be addressed. The immediate importance, and this is one of the things that the calls from the UN mediator to try to bring these talks in Sweden back into being is important, is if you can at least achieve some kind of a momentary ceasefire. And this has happened before, and it's broken down before. But at least if you can create on the ground the conditions by which you pause the fighting long enough so that the parties gather and begin to address the immediate issues so that you can then mobilize international efforts and international support to deal with the larger issues, then maybe you have a chance over the long term of achieving something meaningful. Unfortunately, we are not there in as much as the Trump administration has decided to go all in on the side of the Saudis in militarily holding the line as they see it. And so, unless there is some major breakthrough, and the Houthis, who I agree are militarily on the back foot, but still have strategically the upper hand because of their location and because they're still well armed, they don't necessarily feel like they have to go along with this.
Quick comment from Doug and then Fatima.
No, I was just going to say that's exactly the missing piece here is the Trump administration's policy, banking its entire Middle East strategy on its very staunch support of the Crown Prince. And as you said, the so-called internationally recognized government, the Houthis, from the Trump administration's perspective, really don't factor into the equation. When we speak of trying to have a moment of, reconciliation or stop the violence long enough to have some sort of coming together in talks, that just is not the strategy right now. I mean, look, despite the fact, right, you essentially have a crown prince, leading the Saudi part of this coalition, who's kidnapped the Lebanese prime minister, who's blockaded Qatar, who rounded up all the the other richest people in the kingdom, threw them into the Ritz-Carlton under house arrest, has essentially been the driving force behind this illegal war in Yemen, the Saudi coalition. These are the people that the Trump administration, this is the man that the whole Middle East policy to a large extent has pivoted, and that is skewing the peace equation tremendously. It is prejudicing any attempt to be able to kickstart these peace talks, which as of today at least are supposed to be beginning, I think, December 4th in Stockholm.
Yeah. Can I just bring in Fatima Abu Al Asiri, who is in Washington, senior analyst with the Arabia Foundation. Fatima, from Yemen, and of course this is close to your heart, everything we're talking about. How do you lay the foundations for peace? Martin Griffiths, he's got quite a job on his hands, hasn't he?
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to just say a couple of things to comment on what was said before. When the Saudi-led intervention started in Yemen, I was really apprehensive. And one of the things I was thinking about is maybe it's good that the Saudis are doing it and not the Americans, because the Americans did not have a really good track record in the Middle East either. So no good track record in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan. We heard a lot of civilian deaths. And what brings those lives back? No good track record even in Syria. The Pentagon announced about 6,000 civilian deaths in its campaign against ISIS. So I thought maybe the conduct there is, or the Saudi intervention is going to be better. But bombs have been made to make mistakes, and I think that the calls to perhaps at my core, I'm a peace activist, and I would just rather, not see this war going on. But the reality is the first ballistic missile that was launched in Yemen was launched by the Houthis, not by Saudi Arabia. And everything that has happened hence was just really a reaction. The Houthis have reneged on their deals in the past. And within the National Dialogue Conference, they were accommodated. Everybody felt that they were wronged during the 6 Sada wars that took place between 2003 and 2010. And the youth in Yemen felt that they needed to have a seat on the table. in the National Dialogue Conference, they were clearly heard, but they were really using their participation in the National Dialogue just again to gain more negotiation tactics, more insight into, how Yemen is running. And as soon as the national UN-backed National Dialogue ended, they found a way to conspire against the outcomes and just take over what they think is their rightful, bloodline heritage by violence. It is quite disappointing that after 4 years, we are not necessarily very aware of the dynamics in Yemen and what's happening in Yemen. We're not aware, I think, as I heard from the previous commentators, they're not aware that there's actually a huge Yemen ground force, Yemeni troops that are backed up by the coalition. They're being paid by Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates to try to free, other strategic areas, because there comes the realization that aerial bombardment won't work. But these have been stopped because also street fighting doesn't work. I lived through 2 wars in Yemen, one in the 80s where the south of Yemen had a bloody conflict. In 3 months, 10,000 people died. In 1994, there was the civil war, the secession. More people died. And, a recent statistics that no one talks about is just in 2015 alone, and this is before the Saudis and Emiratis intervened, we had the Houthis and Saleh forces just in the south of Yemen and in Taiz killed over 7,000 people in less than 6 months. So if you leave it to, yes, I think, some of the commentators were right. Yemen's history has some violence in it. And I think that we need to perhaps, yes, empower or create the conditions, the necessary conditions to allow the peace talks. What I'm trying to say is that currently, I don't think that the Houthis have any incentive for that unless there is a push to sanction either Houthis or Iran, which we don't see. This sanctioning over, for Saudi Arabia just is, I would really imagine that Javad Zarif is really happy about the Senate vote yesterday. So, I feel when it comes to Yemen, I'm quite indifferent to what the Senate vote means, because there's just an entire dynamic on the ground, and I think this is just the opportunity for the U.S. Congress to feel good about itself, that they think that they are not taking or partaking in the suffering. But are they doing anything to actually ameliorate the situation in Yemen? I don't think that they are.
Fatima, thank you very much indeed. Fatima Al Asiri from the Arabia Foundation, senior analyst, joining us there from Washington, D.C. Let's bring that back to around the table then. William, Pierre, Douglas, does this vote mean anything? Obviously, William reined me in because I was being perhaps a bit too gung-ho about what this meant about sort of ending US support to what was happening in Yemen. Doug reined me into as well and said, look, this is one step forward. What do you feel, Pierre?
I don't believe that the American support will cease, because, there is one point which seems to me very important. Mohammed bin Salman needs a success, because its history is a very long list of failure, and stalemate, etc. It's what the arrest of Khashoggi, the blockade of Qatar, the war in Yemen, the Ritz operation, etc. Just after that, the Ritz corruption operation, he bought, a yacht and a castle in France. That guy has a very bad, history, which means that he needs a success. And the only success which seems to be accessible for him is a war, is the victory in Yemen. So he's probably doing a blackmail to Trump, explaining that he needs that. If Trump has missed, has choose, to support that guy in the future of Saudi Arabia, he needs a success. So I think that the Americans are not, they can't stop.
William, quick conclusion?
Well, what I would say is that there's no question about it that the vote in the Congress is not going to change anything on the ground in Yemen. And I don't even think it's ultimately going to change American policy. But it is, an indication that the majority support for the idea of Saudi Arabia being America's most important ally in the region, at least in the peninsula, the Gulf, and sort of surrounding areas, is sort of taken as a gospel, is being challenged. And I think that's important I think it's also important in terms of the moral aspect of this. Americans want to be out of, or they want to wash their hands of the blood that they, that they're guilty of shedding in Yemen through their complicity with Saudi Arabia. I think, the Khashoggi murder, as I said, crystallized a lot of people's minds about Saudi Arabia. It changed fundamentally the perceptions of Mohammed bin Salman as somehow this great reformer. Give him a chance, he'll do great things. This is all, in a way, Washington doing something that will, as Fatima was saying, will feel good about itself for having at least made the symbolic gesture. It won't necessarily change anything on the ground unless by some miracle, either the administration under the pressure of a vote, or if Congress actually musters the ability to overturn a veto, then the administration has got to readjust its policy. I think that, unfortunately, we're in the administration is totally deaf to these kinds of criticisms. Saudi Arabia is front and center in terms of the misguided and ludicrous, and in many ways grotesque policy the administration is pursuing to try to link Saudi Arabia, other Sunni Arab states, and Israel in a grand campaign against Iran. Wherever that has to be fought, however it has to be fought, Donald Trump is determined to do so and to empower, support, and give full backing, including material backing, to anybody who is on his side in this. Yeah. That's the reality that we're facing, and that's what we're going to be facing for the next 2 years. Although perhaps the House,
watch the House
under the Democrats
coming in January,
may pick up this cudgel and try to beat the administration a bit more about it.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.